Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to this afternoon's event. Alastair, in your diary, there's an awful lot of nakedness. Mo Mowlam in the bath, Tony Blair in green, I don't know if they're Y-fronts or boxers, actually. Both. Well, there you go. This is a very interesting political insight. Actually, I think what that, as it were, bathing nakedness was about a certain intimacy to power. I mean, you would. It was partly because he was very busy. It was partly because you were very intimate. How do you think the diary? What did the diary do for you? Why did keeping a diary help? What were you doing?
I don't know if it I don't see it as something that was meant to help anything. It's just something that I've done, and I did it before I worked for Tony, and I do it now. And I think people's personalities probably do come across in if they're recording as intensely as people like Tony and I do. It wasn't like an emotional sort of dumping ground, but it was just where I was trying to kind of order things that were going on. And so it was in part just sort of saying, well, this happened today, and this is why I think it happened, and this is what I think about it. And sometimes, I mean, I've got a very bad. When Tony starts to open up, you'll realise he's got an amazing memory. I've got a very bad memory. I think it's one of the reasons why I keep a diary. So sometimes it's about actually committing things to memory. And I think the nakedness thing is funny. I mean, people sort of talked about that, but it would kind of, if you're just describing as is, then I suppose, you know, if you get say we were in a hotel in somewhere and you get one of the coppers comes down and says, the Prime Minister wants to see you, and you go in there and he's got no clothes on, I suppose it's kind of the sort of thing you might remember, because normally you would see him with his clothes on. So actually I think the nakedness that you've noticed is a result of the fact there wasn't really very much nakedness. What makes my diary interesting, and why I think people have found it reasonably interesting, is because of the people that it's about, of which I am one, but not the most important. I think the most important person in that book is Tony Blair. Yeah. I think other very important people within it are Bill Clinton, Bertie Ahern, who's announced today that he's resigning. It is not, nobody can ever claim to write the historical record of anything, but it is a part of a historical record from one perspective, and I've never pretended it's anything other than my perspective.
Why did you start to keep a diary?
Well, I started when I was 15. I think the first diary was when I was 9, got up, went to school, and stopped. The next one was when I was 15, and continuously since 1940. But I think if I look back on it now, it's a combination of two things. First, my father read a book called How to Make 24 Hours Out of Every Day by Arnold Bennett. The argument, everyone is equal in one sense. They've all got 24 hours. How you spend it is of critical importance. And secondly, a sort of, I think, a religious feeling that on the Day of Judgment you've got to say something to the Almighty. So I shall give him my diaries and say, well, what is your assessment? That's the sort of... But you see, the thing really, as I look back on it, is this. All my opinions are based on my experience. And if you write down your experience, you get 3 bites at it. When it happens, when you do it at night, when the pressure's off, and when you read it later and realise you were wrong. That's the benefit of a diary. And so I've just kept it for that purpose. And I said, for example, all my opinions are based on experience. Well, take the war, for example. I was in London during the Blitz. Every night we went down to the shelter. 500 people were killed near where I lived. My brother was killed. Many of my schoolmates were killed. I was in the Air Force as a pilot. Some of my friends there were killed. Came home in the troop ship, heard the UN Charter, we the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering. My attitude to war is based on that. I mean, it wasn't based on a book. Books help you to understand your experience, but if you don't write it down, it isn't there. And a diary is quite different from journalism, which is written for publication, or what else? History, which is a balanced view, or autobiographies, or memoirs, where you hire a lot of researchers to write your triumphs and forget your failures. And it's different from letter writing, which is written for one person. This is written to yourself. And it's a tremendously useful thing to have. I've got a bedside diary I've had since '49. I've got my political diary, and I've also got a 100-year diary, which I worked out with a page for every year. So I was able to look and see how old I would be in 2003 when I was 19. You know, it was a very handy thing to have. And I've found it very, very helpful, but it's really now more than a diary. It's an index to my archives. And my archives are very, very voluminous. And with the diary, I can find what happened. And I can either take an issue and take it all the way back, like nuclear power. I looked it up in my diary. I have 1,205 references to nuclear power. Or I can take a day and blow it up with the speeches, the cuttings, the notes and everything. And so for me, it's a working document. I use it every day to help me to deal with questions. That's why I do it. And whether people read it or not is of no great consequence to me. Though I'm glad. The publisher would be sorry to hear I say that. But if people enjoy it.
That's really interesting. Tony basically is saying that his diary is a small part of a kind of never-ending project about his life that is kind of expanding ever outwards. I think mine is, you've got these voluminous records. I think it's fantastic you have. And I mean, I'm a kind of sort of get rid of things. Actually, the diary is a way of sort of compressing and putting into my own sort of space and compartments. So it's just a very, very different approach. But it's interesting what Tony says here. This business about the reason why people write them. I don't think we should get too sort of hung up on this. I mean, Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and when I did the diary, did the book, I had to submit it to number 10 in the cabinet office for sort of vetting and this, that, and the other. And Jonathan sent me this hilarious. He was one of the first people to read it, and he said of all the things people are going to say about this, nobody can say it's self-serving because you come over as a complete lunatic. And I think that I was conscious of that as well. There were lots of bits during the editing process where people said, I mean, Melissa was talking about, for example, my accounts of some of my meetings with Princess Diana, where I got a little bit sort of moist-eyed and somewhat sort of adolescent. A bit of that, yeah. So people would say, you know, do you really want to keep that in there? And I thought, well, probably not, but I should, because it's there, and I'm now asking people to. I mean, I because I'm maybe not as I do worry about the publisher. I think the publisher does need to sell the books, and therefore I'm happy for the people to sort of. And I'm saying to people, you know, read this and share it with me, and therefore I think if you're going to put a bit of yourself out there, you've really got to put all of yourself out there. What it is what it is. It is a diary. It's what you said and did that day at that time. And one of the things I've tried to do with it in terms of the bigger political context is, because there's so much kind of cynicism about politics and politicians, is actually to say, look, if you get into this, and John Lloyd, as I said to you, I've quoted him in the introduction to the paperback. I think he wrote the most intelligent review, because he made the point that actually all I'm trying to do in this is say that politics is no different to any other walk of life. It's about human beings trying to do their best by what they believe. The big difference, particularly now, is the 24-hour scrutiny that they're under, and the fact that their decisions affect millions and millions of people. But otherwise, they're just you and me. And so I've tried to show that, and it's in that spirit, if there was a spirit, but I think you're sort of slightly flogging a dead horse on this one. I think it just is what it is. There was no kind of motive beyond doing it.